The summer of 1943 began with a strange tension in the air over Western Europe. For months, German air controllers had noticed scattered reports coming from radar stations along the French coast. Blips appeared where no blips should have been, too far from any Allied base, too deep into Luftwaffe territory. Most officers dismissed them as equipment glitches, temperature distortions, or the usual ghosts on the Freya screens. But a handful of radar operators insisted the readings were real. Something was approaching from the west, flying higher and farther than anything they had seen before. The first confirmation arrived unexpectedly on a warm August morning. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance unit near the Bay of Biscay spotted two twin-engine aircraft cruising at high altitude, heading inland with a confidence that felt almost arrogant. At first glance, the German pilots assumed they were British Mosquitoes. But the silhouette was wrong. The wings were longer, the nose sharper, and the engines mounted in a way none of the pilots recognized. The aircraft didn't even attempt to evade. It simply kept moving, as though it had every right to be there. When the reconnaissance pilots returned, their squadron commander dismissed the sighting. "Impossible," he said. "No Allied aircraft has the range to reach this far." Yet within days, similar reports began arriving from units across France and Belgium. Twin-boom fighters were being spotted far beyond the expected operational radius of any American or British aircraft. Each sighting ended the same way. German fighters scrambled to intercept, but by the time they climbed to altitude, the mysterious intruders had vanished. It wasn't long before the first scraps of physical evidence appeared. One P-38 was forced to break off and dive after an engine issue. German observers managed to photograph it from the ground as it passed overhead. The images made their way to Luftwaffe intelligence, and suddenly the tone changed. Analysts compared the photos to known Allied aircraft and realized they were looking at something new. The American P-38 Lightning, but modified, equipped with enlarged drop tanks and stripped for long-range escort missions. This was exactly what the Luftwaffe feared. Until now, their fighters could attack American bombers freely once they passed beyond British fighter range. That narrow, unguarded zone was where most of the Luftwaffe's victories came from. But if P-38s could reach deep into the continent, that zone would disappear. By late August, the sightings intensified. P-38s were being spotted as far as central France, escorting reconnaissance flights and probing Luftwaffe defenses. The German pilots who engaged them reported something even more troubling. These lightnings weren't just reaching deeper. They were staying longer, lingering over targets with endurance no Allied fighter had possessed before. At Luftwaffe headquarters, a few analysts quietly raised the alarm. They argued that the Americans had solved the long-range escort problem, the one the Germans had assumed would protect their industrial heartland. Yet many senior officers refused to believe it. The myth of Allied short-legged fighters had been repeated for so long that it felt almost doctrinal. Still, the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Radio transcripts, gun camera footage, and eyewitness reports painted the same picture. The Americans were preparing to bring the war to the deepest parts of the Reich, and these early P-38 incursions were only the first warning. The radar screens had been telling the truth from the beginning. By late August 1943, Adolf Galland, the charismatic, sharp-eyed general of fighters, had seen enough. Reports of long-range P-38 Lightnings diving deep into German-controlled airspace were piling up on his desk. Radar logs, pilot testimonies, even grainy engine trouble photographs captured from the ground, all of it pointed to one conclusion. The Americans were extending their reach, and quickly. Galland knew what that meant. When the Allies solved the long-range escort problem, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy would collapse. For years, German pilots exploited the air gap, a zone beyond British fighter range where daylight bombers were most vulnerable. It was there that the Luftwaffe inflicted its heaviest losses. If P-38s and later P-47s and P-51s could accompany bombers all the way to the target, those days would end forever. But Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, did not want to hear warnings, especially not from Galland, whose blunt honesty often irritated him. Still, Galland requested a private meeting. He entered Göring's headquarters with a thick folder under his arm, filled with evidence. He expected skepticism, maybe irritation, but he did not expect what came next. Göring listened impatiently as Galland explained the sightings, the reports of deep-range P-38s, and the strategic implications. When Galland finally finished, Göring let out a dismissive laugh. "Impossible," he said. "The Americans do not have the range. Not with fighters." Galland pressed on. He described how the Americans were equipping Lightnings with massive drop tanks and experimenting with fuel-saving escort patterns. He argued that the Luftwaffe needed to adapt urgently, but Göring waved him off and accused frontline pilots of exaggeration, even hallucination. He insisted Allied fighters were still short-legged and always would be. Galland couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had once admired Göring's leadership, but now he saw a man trapped in old assumptions, unable to accept the changing reality of the war. The Luftwaffe's finest tactician was warning him of a clear danger, yet Göring clung to outdated intelligence simply because it was comfortable. The next day, at a larger staff meeting, Galland presented the same evidence again. This time, several squadron leaders supported him. They spoke about Lightnings escorting reconnaissance flights over occupied France, about engagements where German fighters were surprised at altitudes and distances previously safe from Allied aircraft. Still, Göring remained unmoved. "You are all mistaken," he declared. "Until I see one of these so-called long-range fighters with my own eyes, I will not accept such nonsense." The room fell silent. Galland realized in that moment that the Luftwaffe command wasn't just slow, it was blind. By early autumn, the Americans increased their deep penetration missions. The P-38s stayed longer, flew farther, and began escorting bombers toward vital industrial zones. Losses among German interceptors rose. Squadrons reported that the enemy no longer turned back at the expected points. Galland's warnings had been correct. The threat was real, immediate, and growing. But Göring's refusal to acknowledge it meant the Luftwaffe reacted too late, and the consequences would echo through the coming year. What Galland saw in the summer of 1943 was not just a new aircraft. It was the beginning of the end of German air superiority. And the tragedy was not that the threat arrived, but that the one man who could have prepared for it simply did not believe it existed. By the early autumn of 1943, the rumors about long-range P-38 Lightnings were no longer rumors. They were meeting German fighters in the sky and leaving behind stories that spread through Luftwaffe airfields like wildfire. The first clear encounter happened over northern France. A staffel of Bf-109s scrambled to intercept what they assumed were unescorted American reconnaissance aircraft. The pilots climbed hard, expecting the usual hit-and-run strike on vulnerable bombers. Instead, when they broke through the clouds, they found two P-38s waiting for them. Not fleeing, not diving away, but turning in to fight. The twin-boom fighters held their altitude with surprising stability. Their large drop tanks were still attached, meaning they had already flown an impressive distance before the Germans ever saw them. One German pilot later wrote in his diary, "They should not have been there, and yet they were. They fought like they belonged over France." That engagement ended indecisively, but it marked a shift in mindset. The Luftwaffe could no longer assume American fighters would turn back early. The safe zones, the regions German pilots relied on for tactical advantage, were shrinking by the week. A second encounter removed any remaining doubt. A formation of P-38s escorting B-17 reconnaissance bombers appeared over the Ruhr, far deeper into German territory than Allied fighters had ever flown before. The German interception units were stunned. As they dove in to attack, expecting a quick disruption of the bomber group, the P-38s peeled away from their escort positions and met them head-on. Gun camera footage captured by German pilots revealed something striking. The Lightnings were not merely accompanying the bombers. They were actively defending them, matching the German fighters maneuver for maneuver. One P-38 even managed a vertical climb that forced a surprised FW-190 to break off its attack entirely. That climb should have been impossible at that stage of the mission, yet it happened. Every encounter carried the same message. These fighters had endurance. They had fuel, and they were prepared to fight on equal terms, even hundreds of miles from British bases. Luftwaffe command tried to explain away the sightings. Some officers suggested the lightnings must have landed at hidden forward airstrips. Others insisted the encounters were misidentifications, hallucinations caused by combat strain. But the pilots knew better. They had fought these aircraft face to face. They had seen the oversized drop tanks, the aggressive escort tactics, and the unmistakable confidence of pilots who knew they could make it home. One major turning point came over Belgium. A German strike force caught a mixed group of B-26 bombers heading east. When they attacked, expecting no escort at that range, a squadron of P-38s suddenly emerged from above them. The ambush turned into chaos. The lightnings chased the interceptors for kilometers, pursuing them far longer than any British Spitfire ever could. German pilots returned to base shaken, some landing with empty guns but full disbelief. As combat reports accumulated, a new reality settled across the Luftwaffe's fighter wing. The Americans were not testing limits, they were expanding them. The Luftwaffe's advantage, once built on predictable patterns of distance and fuel, was eroding rapidly. The sky itself was delivering the evidence Göring refused to accept. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were no longer whispering about long-range American escorts, they were shouting about them. Reports poured in from every corner of occupied Europe. P-38s over Belgium, P-47s diving over the Ruhr, even early sightings of P-51s appearing farther east than anyone believed possible. The frontline pilots understood exactly what these encounters meant. The air war was changing, and the Luftwaffe was not changing with it. But inside Hermann Göring's headquarters, the mood was completely different. Göring dismissed most field reports as exaggeration or pilot nervousness. He still insisted that Allied fighters could not escort bombers deep into German airspace. His belief was based on outdated intelligence and, more importantly, on pride, the idea that the Luftwaffe he had built could not be outperformed by American engineering. Galland, frustrated and exhausted, continued to bring evidence directly to Göring's desk. He showed photographs, squadron logs, even radar traces. But Göring's reaction never changed. "The Americans are bluffing," he insisted. "They cannot sustain such flights. It is impossible." Yet the bombers kept coming. And now they came with company. Throughout the autumn raids on Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Marienburg, Luftwaffe interception groups began encountering escorts earlier and earlier in the mission. German fighter wings attempted their traditional tactic: strike the bombers just beyond Allied fighter range. But each time they moved to attack, long-range escorts appeared, P-38s first, then P-47s with massive drop tanks. The window of German opportunity was closing rapidly. Some fighter commanders begged for changes: more fuel production, more emphasis on high-altitude fighters, emergency tactics to adapt to the new Allied strategy. But their requests were buried under Göring's refusal to accept that the Americans had solved the problem. In meeting after meeting, Göring insisted that Allied pilots were overextended and vulnerable. He claimed the reports of deep-range escorts were misinterpretations or isolated accidents. The disconnect grew dangerous. Luftwaffe pilots risked their lives in the sky, only to return and have their experiences dismissed as impossibilities. Morale dipped sharply. Veteran pilots later recalled feeling as though Berlin was fighting a different war entirely, a war that existed only on paper. By November, the consequences of Göring's denial became impossible to hide. Escort fighters began penetrating so deep into the Reich that German squadrons were forced to launch earlier, fly farther, and fight at ranges they were never prepared for. Fuel shortages worsened. Aircraft maintenance suffered. Entire Gruppen returned home with only a handful of planes still operational. Meanwhile, American losses sharply decreased. With reliable escorts, bombers pressed their attacks with growing confidence. Factory after factory fell under daylight bombardment. The Ruhr, once considered nearly invulnerable, burned under week-long raids. Inside Luftwaffe command, the breaking point came during a staff briefing when Galland bluntly declared, "We are losing the air war because we refuse to see reality." But Göring, still clinging to pride, refused to acknowledge his mistake. Rather than admit the Americans had achieved something extraordinary, he blamed his own pilots for cowardice, a statement that shattered morale across the fighter force. The truth was the opposite. The pilots had seen the danger months earlier. They had sounded the alarm. But Germany's highest air commander had blinded the Luftwaffe at the very moment it needed clarity most. Göring's denial didn't just slow the Luftwaffe's response. It cost them the air war. By the start of 1944, the consequences of Göring's denial had become brutally clear. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now fighting a war it could no longer win. The Americans had solved the long-range escort problem, first with the P-38, then with the P-47, and finally with the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft whose range and performance shattered every assumption the Luftwaffe had relied on. When the first P-51s appeared deep inside Germany, German fighter groups were stunned. These sleek, high-altitude escorts stayed with the bombers from takeoff to target and all the way home. The air gap, the zone where German fighters once attacked unopposed, simply vanished. Now, whenever the Luftwaffe rose to intercept, they found American fighters already waiting for them. The effects were immediate and devastating. American bombers no longer suffered catastrophic losses. Instead, it was the Luftwaffe that began to bleed. Every mission cost Germany more experienced pilots, pilots who could not be replaced. Fuel shortages grew worse, training programs shortened, and inexperienced recruits were pushed into cockpits they were not ready for. Adolf Galland watched the decline with growing despair. He had warned of this moment, argued for reforms, demanded new aircraft, begged for a strategy that matched the reality of Allied capabilities. But it was too late. The Americans were producing fighters faster than Germany could destroy them, and pilots faster than Germany could train replacements. The skies over Germany became a battleground the Luftwaffe no longer controlled. Day after day, the bomber streams came, hundreds of aircraft stretching across the horizon, flanked by rings of P-51s that carved through German interceptors with ruthless efficiency. Veteran German aces described the new air war as hopeless, a grinding attrition they could not escape. One pilot wrote, "We are hunted now. They own the sky." By spring, the Luftwaffe's decline turned into collapse. Maintenance hangars lacked fuel. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Entire fighter wings were grounded because their supplies had run out. Even when aircraft managed to take off, they faced overwhelming odds. American escort fighters roamed the skies freely, attacking German formations even before they reached the bomber streams. Meanwhile, the industrial heart of Germany was systematically dismantled. Ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation hubs, all targeted and destroyed with increasing precision. Every bomb dropped tightened the noose. The Luftwaffe's inability to stop the raids meant Germany's war machine was being crushed from above. Göring, still unwilling to accept responsibility, blamed everyone except himself. The pilots, the commanders, the weather, even fate. But those who fought the war knew the truth. The Luftwaffe had been defeated long before the bombs fell on Berlin. It had been defeated the moment its leadership refused to acknowledge the rise of long-range American air power. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. Squadrons that once dominated European skies now operated with a fraction of their aircraft. The Allies flew where they wanted, when they wanted, with no meaningful resistance. The war in the air, once balanced, even contested, had become a one-sided struggle. And in that struggle lay the final consequence. A war the Luftwaffe could never hope to win. Not because its pilots lacked courage or skill, but because its leaders refused to see the future when it was still possible to change it. The sky had chosen its victor long before the ground war ended.